He laughed out loud before the judge even finished reading the docket. Not a nervous laugh, not a mistake. A confident, careless sound that echoed off the wooden walls of the courtroom, as if he already owned the outcome. "She has nothing," my husband said, turning slightly in his chair so the people behind him could hear. "I don't know why we're even here." His mistress didn't bother hiding her smile. She looked me up and down slowly, deliberately, like she was assessing a bad purchase. Her lips curled as she leaned closer to him and whispered something that made him chuckle again. Then she tilted her head in my direction and said, loud enough for the front row to catch it, "Look at her. She didn't even try." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. But no one said a word. I stood there silently, hands folded, eyes forward. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at her. I didn't react at all. From the outside, I probably looked small, defeated, exactly what they expected. That was when the judge raised her hand. The room fell silent so fast you could hear the air conditioning hum. My husband was still smiling when she said, calmly but sharply, "Enough." In that moment, I knew something they didn't. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Dark wood paneling, hard benches polished smooth by decades of anxious hands. The seal of the court hung behind the judge's chair, heavy and indifferent. This wasn't a place for drama. It was a place for facts. And yet somehow they had turned it into a performance. My husband sat at the long table with his attorney, relaxed, one ankle resting casually on his knee. He looked like a man waiting for a flight, not someone about to dismantle a marriage. His lawyer leaned back as well, pen idle, already bored. The mistress sat just behind them, close enough to touch his shoulder if she wanted. She had chosen a tailored cream jacket. Tasteful, expensive, intentional. She wanted to be seen. I sat alone. No lawyer beside me yet, no entourage, just a folder in my bag and my own breathing to keep me steady. I was acutely aware of how that looked. Alone meant unprepared. Silent meant weak. That was the story they were telling themselves, and judging by the smug ease on their faces, it was a story they had rehearsed many times. The judge adjusted her glasses and scanned the room. She didn't look at me first. She didn't look at him either. She looked at the entire scene, as if she were taking inventory. I noticed the way her gaze lingered for half a second too long on my husband's grin, the way her eyes flicked briefly to the woman behind him before returning to the file in front of her. My husband cleared his throat, ready to continue. He had momentum. He had confidence. He had assumed the floor was his. That assumption was his first mistake. "Before we proceed," the judge said, her voice measured, "I want to clarify a few things." My husband straightened just slightly. His lawyer leaned forward now, alert. The mistress's smile faltered for the briefest moment, then returned, tighter this time. The judge looked at my husband. "Mr. Carter," she said, using his last name with precision, "you seem very certain about your position." He smiled again. "Yes, Your Honor, this is a straightforward case." "Is it?" she replied, not unkindly. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough. I kept my eyes on the bench. I focused on the weight of my feet against the floor, the way my pulse thudded in my ears. I had imagined this room so many times before today. Imagined myself shaking, imagined my voice cracking, imagined humiliation swallowing me whole. Instead, I felt something else. Stillness. The judge made a note on her pad. "We will hear arguments," she said, "but we will do so in an orderly fashion. This court will not tolerate commentary, laughter, or personal remarks." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the woman behind my husband. The mistress crossed her arms. My husband nodded, still confident, still convinced this was a formality. He had no idea how much he had already revealed. The arrogance, the ease, the belief that I was standing there with empty hands. If he had looked at me then, really looked, he might have noticed I wasn't afraid. But he didn't. He was too busy enjoying what he thought was the final act. As the clerk called the case name, I thought back to the moment I had realized this hearing was never going to end the way they planned. Not today, not with me standing there. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought preparation looked loud. They thought power announced itself. They were wrong on all counts. When the judge nodded for proceedings to begin, my husband leaned back again, ready to perform. His lawyer rose, smoothing his tie, already shaping the narrative where I was a footnote. I let them talk. I let them believe. Because this was never about speaking first. It was about knowing when the room was finally ready to listen. The ticking of the courtroom clock pulled me backward in time, to a version of my life that felt almost fictional now, back when people used to tell me how lucky I was. I was 31 when I met Daniel. Back then, I had a life that felt solid in my own hands. I worked as a project coordinator for a regional nonprofit in Northern Virginia, the kind of job that didn't impress at dinner parties, but paid my bills and gave me purpose. I rented a small townhouse with creaky stairs and a postage stamp patio, and on quiet evenings I drank tea on the back steps, content with the steady rhythm of a life I'd built myself. I wasn't looking for rescue, I wasn't chasing status. I wanted partnership, someone steady, someone honest. Daniel appeared ordinary at first, which was exactly why I trusted him. We met at a community fundraiser of all places. I was there coordinating volunteers, clipboard tucked under my arm, when he approached me to ask where the restrooms were. He laughed when I pointed in the wrong direction by mistake, then stayed to talk even after he'd found them. There was no dramatic spark, no sweeping declaration. Just an easy conversation that stretched longer than either of us expected. He listened, really listened. He asked about my work and didn't glaze over when I explained it. He told me about his career in commercial development, about projects he was proud of, mistakes he'd learned from. He spoke carefully, like someone who valued being understood. That was what disarmed me most. Daniel never rushed. He didn't love bomb. He didn't promise me the world. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered small details like how I hated crowded restaurants and preferred quiet walks after dinner. He framed himself as a man who believed in loyalty above everything else. "I've seen what cheating does to families," he told me once, shaking his head. "I'd never do that to someone I love." I believed him because at the time, nothing contradicted it. When I met his family, the approval felt immediate but measured. His parents were polite, reserved, the kind of people who valued appearances and tradition. They complimented my manners, my professionalism, my supportive nature. The word lodged somewhere uncomfortable in my chest, but I ignored it. I told myself I was being sensitive. At family dinners, Daniel spoke confidently, often filling the space with stories of work and plans for the future. I noticed that when conversations drifted toward decisions or finances, he answered before I could. When someone asked me a question, he sometimes jumped in to clarify, smiling as if he were helping. I didn't see it as control then. I saw it as efficiency, as care. Our wedding was modest but elegant. Friends told me I looked calm, grounded, happy. They said we balanced each other. Daniel liked to say the same thing. He called me his anchor, his stabilizing force. I wore the title proudly, unaware of how quietly it would reshape me. From the outside, our marriage looked enviable. We hosted dinner parties. We attended charity events together. Photos of us appeared on social media with captions about teamwork and shared goals. People commented on how strong we seemed, how well matched. I believed them because I wanted to. There were moments even then that should have made me pause. Decisions Daniel made quickly, then explained afterward. Plans that shifted without discussion. Jokes about how I handled the details while he focused on the big picture. Each time I adjusted. Each time I told myself this was what compromise looked like. Love requires flexibility, I thought. Marriage means choosing peace. What I didn't understand was that peace, once chosen too often, becomes permission. By the 3rd year of our marriage, people no longer asked what I did. They asked how Daniel's projects were going. They asked if I was enjoying supporting him. The way the questions were framed mattered, but I didn't have language for that yet. I remember one evening at a neighbor's gathering when someone congratulated Daniel on a recent deal. "Couldn't have done it without her," he said, gesturing vaguely in my direction, before turning back to continue the conversation. No name, no specifics, just a passing acknowledgement like I was part of the furniture. I smiled. I always smiled. Looking back now, I can see how carefully the image was constructed. A competent man, a supportive wife, a marriage that ran smoothly because one person carried the weight quietly while the other took the credit publicly. I didn't feel erased all at once. That's the part people misunderstand. Erasure is slow. It happens in inches, in moments you dismiss because you don't want to seem ungrateful or paranoid or difficult. By the time I realized how much space I'd given up, it already felt normal to stand slightly behind him, to let him speak first, to let him decide. Sitting in that courtroom years later, listening to him laugh as if I were nothing, I understood something with painful clarity. The marriage everyone envied hadn't collapsed suddenly. It had been tilting for a long time. And I had been the one steadying it, never realizing I was slowly handing over the ground beneath my own feet. The first thing I gave up didn't feel like a sacrifice at the time. It felt like a reasonable adjustment, the kind married people make without keeping score. A year into our marriage, my supervisor offered me a chance to lead a new regional initiative. It would have meant longer hours, more visibility, and eventually a promotion. When I told Daniel about it over dinner, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He asked practical questions first. How often would I travel? How unpredictable would my schedule be? How would it look if we were rarely seen together at events that mattered to his work? "It's just bad timing," he said gently. "Things are about to get really busy for me. We need one of us to be stable right now." I remember nodding, even feeling proud of the decision I was making. I told my supervisor I wasn't ready. I framed it as a choice, not a concession. Daniel thanked me later that night, kissed my forehead, and said he couldn't do what he was doing without my support. That word again. Support. After that, the adjustments came more easily. I started handling more of the logistics of our life because it made sense. I coordinated schedules. I smoothed over conflicts. I kept track of deadlines that weren't mine. At first, Daniel asked for help. Then he assumed it. Somewhere along the way, helping became handling. There were moments when my involvement made the difference between success and failure. I drafted proposals late at night because his deadlines were impossible. I coached him through difficult conversations before meetings. I caught errors that would have embarrassed him publicly. Each time he thanked me privately. Publicly, the praise was always his. Friends admired his drive. Colleagues praised his leadership. Family members marveled at how much he accomplished. When someone once asked how he managed it all, he laughed and said, "I've got a great system at home." That was the closest I came to acknowledgement. Over time, the language changed. He stopped asking if I could take care of something and started telling me he'd already assumed I would. If I hesitated, he framed it as stress. "I just need you to have my back right now." If I pushed, even gently, he reminded me how much pressure he was under. "I thought we were a team," he said once, when I questioned why a decision had been made without me. The implication stung. Teams didn't question. Teams absorbed. The first time I felt genuinely small was over something trivial. We were at a dinner with people important to his career when someone complimented the organization of an event we'd hosted the week before. Before I could respond, Daniel waved a hand dismissively and said, "Oh, she just helped with a few details." Just helped. The words landed harder than they should have. I felt my face warm, felt something tighten in my chest. I considered correcting him, listing the hours I'd spent coordinating vendors, managing budgets, fielding last-minute changes. Instead, I laughed it off. I told myself it wasn't worth making things awkward. Later that night, when I mentioned it, he frowned. "You're reading too much into it," he said. "You know what you contributed. Why do you need everyone else to?" I didn't have an answer that sounded reasonable out loud, so I dropped it. That pattern repeated. When I remembered things differently than he did, He suggested my emotions were clouding my memory. When I brought up specific examples, he accused me of keeping score. "That's not healthy," he said. "I don't know why you're suddenly so defensive." I started questioning myself. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe I was exaggerating my role. After all, I wasn't the one signing contracts or standing at podiums. I wasn't the face of anything. I was behind the scenes, where things were supposed to be invisible. What I didn't understand then was how invisibility compounds. As Daniel's world expanded, mine narrowed. Decisions happened in rooms I wasn't in. Conversations took place after I'd gone to bed. Paperwork came home already finalized. When I asked questions, he framed it as protection. "I didn't want to burden you with this." Or worse, "You wouldn't have needed to worry." It took me a long time to realize that being spared worry also meant being spared authority. I stayed silent because I believed endurance was loyalty, because I feared that pushing back would destabilize everything we'd built, because I had invested so much of myself into his success that imagining separation felt like erasing my own past. The imbalance became structural before I knew how to name it. My contributions were informal, undocumented, easy to dismiss. His were official, recorded, visible. If history were ever written, it would be written in his favor. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, watching him sign documents at the counter and feeling an odd sense of distance. The papers weren't meant for me to see. I didn't ask what they were. I told myself trust meant not asking. That was the moment I should have paid attention. Because by the time I began to sense something was wrong, the ground rules had already been set. I had given up more than time or opportunity. I had given up my place in the story. And when someone else eventually stepped into it, there was nothing on record to prove I had ever been there at all. The shift didn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, disguised as efficiency, and by the time I noticed it, it had already rearranged the room around me. The first time it happened, I thought it was a mistake. Daniel came home later than usual and mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd accepted an invitation to join a new professional association. It was the kind of thing we normally discussed together. Membership meant networking, visibility, long-term implications. I asked when he'd applied. "Oh, I already took care of it," he said, loosening his tie. "It just made sense." I waited for more. An explanation. An apology, maybe. Instead, he moved on to talking about dinner. I told myself it wasn't worth making an issue out of something so small. But the feeling lingered. A faint sense that I had arrived late to a conversation that should have included me from the start. After that, his tone changed in subtle ways. He spoke less like a partner and more like a manager assigning tasks. Not unkindly, but definitively. Plans were presented as conclusions, not questions. If I asked why something had been decided a certain way, he sighed as if I were slowing him down. "You're overthinking this," he said more than once. "Trust me." The phrase began to irritate me, though I couldn't fully explain why. Trust, in his mouth, had stopped meaning transparency. It meant compliance. Decisions started happening without me. Financial ones, social ones, things that affected our shared life. I would hear about them afterward, framed as updates. When I pointed out that I would have liked to be involved, he bristled. "I'm trying to protect you from stress," he said. "You don't need to carry all this." What he didn't say was that he no longer believed I should carry it. The first time he spoke for me happened at a dinner party hosted by one of his colleagues. We were seated at a long table, the kind where conversations overlap and blur. Someone across from us asked me about my work, genuinely interested. I opened my mouth to answer, and Daniel cut in smoothly. "She's taken a step back professionally," he said, smiling. "We decided it made more sense for her to focus on supporting what I'm building." I froze. The words were wrong. Not just inaccurate, but definitive. He had framed my choices as mutual decisions, my career as a footnote to his. I glanced at him, waiting for some sign that he realized what he'd done. He didn't look back. The conversation moved on. I sat there, nodding, smiling, feeling like I had been quietly rewritten in front of a room full of strangers. When I brought it up later, he looked genuinely annoyed. "Why are you making such a big deal out of that?" he asked. "It's not like you're unhappy, are you?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't about the comment. It was about my feelings, my gratitude, my compliance. I hesitated, and that hesitation became his proof. "You're imagining problems," he said. "You always do this when things are going well." I started to recognize the pattern then. How quickly my concerns were reframed as emotional instability. How often facts were softened into perceptions. If I insisted, he accused me of being confrontational. If I backed down, he took it as agreement. The rewriting extended to our past. When I reminded him of specific moments where I had taken the lead, he shrugged. "You helped," he said. "That's what spouses do." Helped. Again. His family reinforced the shift without ever stating it outright. At gatherings, they praised me for being supportive, patient, adaptable, never capable, never accomplished. When I mentioned an idea or opinion, it was acknowledged politely, then redirected through Daniel, who would rephrase it as if it had originated with him. One evening, his mother pulled me aside and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "It's good that you know when to let him take charge. Men like Daniel need space to thrive." The comment landed like a warning. I nodded, thanked her, and felt something cold settle in my chest. I began arguing with myself in private. Maybe this was a phase. Maybe stress had changed him temporarily. Maybe I was being too sensitive. I weighed every reaction, calculating the cost of resistance. I told myself silence was strategic, that pushing back now would only make things worse. What finally broke through my denial wasn't a dramatic betrayal. It was a small, unmistakable moment. We were reviewing documents one evening, or rather Daniel was. I noticed my name missing from a section where it had always been before. When I pointed it out, expecting confusion, he barely glanced at the page. "That was intentional," he said. The words were casual, unguarded. There was no apology, no explanation, just a statement of fact. "Why?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rush of blood in my ears. He looked at me then, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, not guilt, calculation. "It simplifies things," he said. "Trust me." In that moment, I understood that this wasn't about oversight or protection. It was about control, about narrowing my role until it could be erased without consequence. I went to bed that night with a weight in my chest that wouldn't lift. The man I had married hadn't suddenly changed. He had simply stopped pretending. Control hadn't arrived with cruelty. It had arrived wrapped in reason, reinforced by silence, and justified by my own willingness to endure. And by the time I realized what was happening, the narrative of my life was already being written without me. The invitation arrived 3 weeks late, forwarded to me by accident, and even then it didn't include my name. It was a formal reception hosted by one of Daniel's senior partners, a public celebration tied to a major development deal he'd been boasting about for months. Normally, I would have known about it immediately. Normally, I would have helped plan what we wore, how we arrived, who we needed to speak to. This time, I learned about it because a mutual acquaintance asked if I was excited for the event and looked confused when I said I hadn't heard anything. Daniel brushed it off when I asked him. "I didn't think you'd want to go," he said lightly. "It's mostly work people." The lie sat between us, thin and obvious. I didn't argue. I simply said I would be there. The night of the reception, the venue glowed with the kind of polished warmth meant to signal success. Soft lighting, white tablecloths, waiters moving quietly with trays of champagne. As I stepped inside, I felt dozens of eyes flick toward me, then away, uncertain. I scanned the room for Daniel. I found him immediately. He stood near the center of the space, relaxed, confident, surrounded by people who mattered. And beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, was her. She wore a dark green dress that hugged her perfectly, elegant without trying too hard. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, familiar, possessive. When someone laughed at something he said, she laughed too, just a beat later, like she'd practiced the timing. No one looked surprised. I stood there longer than I meant to, taking in the scene as if my mind needed proof before it could accept what my eyes were showing me. This wasn't secrecy. This wasn't an affair being hidden. This was presentation. When Daniel noticed me, his expression flickered. Not guilt, annoyance. He excused himself from the group and walked toward me with a polite smile that felt rehearsed. "I didn't think you were coming," he said. "I wasn't invited," I replied, equally calm. He glanced around quickly, lowering his voice. "Let's not make this a thing. Tonight isn't about us." That was the first time he said it out loud, not us. Before I could respond, the host approached, hand extended. "Daniel," he said warmly, "so glad you could make it." Daniel turned, beaming. "Of course. Thank you for having us." Us. The host's gaze shifted to the woman beside him, and Daniel didn't hesitate. "This is Claire," he said. "She's been a huge support through all of this." Claire smiled graciously, accepting the compliment like it belonged to her. I stood there, invisible. No one introduced me. No one asked who I was. I felt myself becoming something awkward, an extra piece of furniture no one had planned for. A few people glanced at me, then away, clearly unsure. I could have spoken up. I could have corrected him. I didn't. I watched, detached, as Daniel moved through the room with her at his side. His family arrived shortly after and greeted Claire warmly, kissing her cheek, drawing her into conversation. His mother squeezed her hand and said something that made Claire laugh. Daniel's sister looped an arm through hers like they'd known each other for years. When they saw me, they smiled politely, distantly, the way you smile at someone you no longer recognize as part of the inner circle. I felt the humiliation settle slowly, not as a sharp sting but as a heavy weight. I was present, but I was not acknowledged. I existed in the gaps between conversations, in the pauses where my name should have been. Leaving would have been easier. But I understood suddenly and clearly that leaving would complete the story they were telling. The story where I faded quietly while someone else stepped seamlessly into my place. So I stayed. I stood tall. I spoke when spoken to. I refused to disappear on their terms. Daniel never looked at me again that night. When the reception finally ended, I walked out alone, my steps steady, my face composed. The drive home felt endless. By the time I reached the house, my hands were trembling. Daniel arrived later. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He accused. "You embarrassed me," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "Showing up like that." I stared at him, incredulous. "You introduced another woman as your support," I said quietly. "In front of everyone." He shrugged. "People already assume things. I didn't correct them." That was when it clicked. This hadn't been impulsive. It had been planned, rehearsed, executed with precision. "You erased me," I said. He sighed, as if exhausted by the conversation. "You're being dramatic." The words no longer landed the way they once had. Something in me had shifted. I could see the pattern now, clear and unmistakable. The late invitation, the public presentation, the family's acceptance. This was not a misunderstanding. This was replacement. That night, I lay awake replaying every moment. Not with confusion, but with clarity, the way Claire had stood so confidently in a space that used to be mine. The way Daniel hadn't hesitated. The way no one questioned it. They believed I had no defense, no claim, no power. They believed I would shrink. As I stared at the ceiling in the dark, something hard and steady formed beneath the ache. A realization I hadn't allowed myself before. They erased me publicly because they were certain I could not push back. And for the first time since this began, I knew exactly how wrong they were. Sleep didn't come easily after that night, but when it did, it was shallow and restless, like my mind refused to fully power down. I woke before dawn with the strange clarity that comes when denial finally burns itself out. I wasn't looking for reassurance anymore. I wasn't waiting for explanations. I wanted to know what was real. That shift mattered. A few days later, I was sorting through a drawer in the study, the one Daniel rarely touched because he considered it mine. It was full of old folders, expired warranties, and documents we no longer needed but had never thrown away. I wasn't searching for anything in particular. I was cleaning, trying to reclaim some small sense of order. That was when I noticed the folder. It was thin, tucked between two outdated insurance packets. Its label faded enough that I almost missed it. The name on it was familiar, but the date wasn't. I pulled it out, more curious than suspicious, and flipped it open. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Standard language, formal phrasing, the kind of document you skim once and forget. I was about to put it back when a line near the bottom caught my eye. It didn't match what I'd been told. I read it again, slower this time. Then a third time, carefully. The wording was precise, deliberate, and unmistakable. My name appeared in a section where, according to Daniel, it no longer belonged. Not as a courtesy, not as an afterthought, as a requirement. My first instinct was to doubt myself. Legal language can be deceptive. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe this had been revised later. Maybe there was an addendum I didn't know about. I closed the folder and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Then I opened my laptop. Cross-checking took longer than I expected. Not because the information was hard to find, but because I kept stopping, needing to breathe. Each confirmation landed with a strange mix of dread and relief. The document was valid, the date was correct, and the clause I'd stumbled over hadn't been superseded. It had been ignored deliberately. The realization settled over me like cold water. This wasn't a technicality, it wasn't symbolic, it was structural. The narrative Daniel had been selling everyone, that I was irrelevant, replaceable, legally inconsequential, wasn't just cruel, it was false. And he knew it. I sat back in my chair, hands trembling slightly, and let the implications unfold. Suddenly, the rush to erase me made sense. The public replacement, the rehearsed confidence, the certainty that I would accept whatever terms were handed to me. They needed me to believe I had nothing. I understood then why this had never come up in conversation, why Daniel had been so adamant about simplifying things, why paperwork had started appearing with my name missing. This wasn't oversight. It was strategy. What startled me most was how sure they'd been that I would never find it. They assumed I wouldn't look, or if I did, that I wouldn't understand. They assumed my silence meant ignorance, not restraint. The same invisibility they'd forced on me had become their blind spot. I didn't confront Daniel that day, or the next. The urge was there, sharp and tempting. I imagined demanding explanations, watching his composure crack, forcing him to acknowledge what he'd done. But I knew exactly how that conversation would go. He would deny, minimize, reframe. Tell me I was misreading things. He would turn my discovery into another example of me being emotional, difficult, unstable, and he would adjust his strategy accordingly. I wasn't ready to give up the element of surprise. Instead, I made a call, a careful one, to someone who had once been peripherally involved, a person Daniel had written off years ago as irrelevant. When I mentioned the clause, there was a pause on the line, not confusion, recognition. "That's still enforceable," they said finally, "if it's what I think it is." The confirmation sent a jolt through me, electric and grounding all at once. I asked questions, precise ones. I listened more than I spoke. By the time we hung up, there was no doubt left. This mattered. For the first time since the reception, since the courtroom laughter, I felt steady, not triumphant, not angry, just clear. The fog I'd been living in began to lift, revealing a landscape that made sense again. I understood now why they'd moved so quickly to replace me, why the performance had been so public. They needed momentum. They needed the story to feel settled before anyone questioned it, including me. That night when Daniel came home, I watched him carefully. The way he moved through the house as if it already belonged to someone else. The ease with which he avoided my gaze. the confidence that assumed I was still operating with half the information. I said nothing. Silence had become something else entirely. It was no longer the absence of voice, it was control. I began to observe instead of react, to listen for inconsistencies, to note assumptions, to let him believe his version of reality had already won, because now I knew something they didn't. This wasn't the end of my role. It was the reason they were so desperate to write me out of it. And if this piece existed, there were others. I closed the folder, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it. The house felt different after that, less like a place I was being pushed out of and more like a chessboard where I had finally seen the full layout. They thought the story was already finished. I knew it had only just begun. The papers were handed to me on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped through the mail slot with a dull thud that echoed through the house. No warning, no conversation, just an envelope thick with finality, my name typed cleanly across the front like a label on a box someone was ready to discard. I didn't open it right away. I carried it into the kitchen, set it on the counter, and stared at it while the kettle boiled dry on the stove. I already knew what it was. Daniel had been moving too confidently, too publicly, for it not to be coming. When I finally slid the documents out, the language was cold and efficient. Divorce petition. Proposed settlement. Pages of tidy paragraphs reducing years of marriage to bullet points and percentages. According to the version laid out in black and white, I had contributed little. I was entitled to almost nothing. The offer was framed as generous, considerate, fair. It was anything but. Daniel came home that evening as if nothing unusual had happened. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and waited for me to say something. When I didn't, he sighed and picked up the papers from the counter. "I assumed you'd already seen these," he said, flipping through them. "I wanted to handle this like adults." "Adults," I repeated quietly. He nodded. "This doesn't have to be messy. The terms are reasonable." Reasonable. The word felt rehearsed. I read his face as he spoke, the way his eyes flicked briefly to gauge my reaction. He was measuring damage, not empathy. "If you fight this," he continued, lowering his voice, "it won't look good for you. People already have opinions. Dragging it out would just make things harder." There it was. The threat, wrapped in concern. Compliance offered as dignity. Claire appeared in the doorway then, as if on cue. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Her presence was the punctuation at the end of his sentence. She stood comfortably in my space, already assuming ownership, already certain of the outcome. "I'm sure this is a lot to process," she said, her tone smooth. "But it's probably best for everyone to move forward." Everyone, except me. I glanced back at the papers, at the neat way my life had been minimized. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were so certain, so calm, so sure I was cornered. What they didn't know was how carefully I was listening. I didn't argue. I didn't correct a single falsehood. I asked neutral questions instead. Timelines, procedures. What would happen next if I didn't sign immediately? Daniel answered easily, relieved by my lack of resistance. His shoulders relaxed. His voice softened. "I knew you'd be reasonable," he said. Reasonable to him meant quiet. The pressure came from all sides after that. Subtle messages. Family members checking in under the guise of concern. Mutual acquaintances hinting that dragging things out would only hurt me. Daniel himself reminding me how exhausting conflict could be. "This doesn't have to define you," he said one evening, as if he were doing me a favor. "Take what's offered and start fresh." I nodded. I listened. I said very little. Every word they spoke confirmed what I already understood. They believed the story was airtight. They believed the law was on their side. Most of all, they believed I was still operating in the dark. My silence made them careless. Daniel started speaking more freely, explaining things he would have guarded before. He talked about plans, about how quickly things would move once this was settled. He complained about the inconvenience of paperwork, the irritation of delays. "You don't want this to get ugly," he he warned casually, swirling the ice in his glass. "I have resources you don't." I looked at him then, really looked, at the certainty on his face, at the way he leaned back, already celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet. "I just want it handled properly," I said. He smiled. "Of course you do." They mistook my restraint for fear. They mistook my questions for confusion. They mistook my composure for resignation. And because of that, they showed me everything. By the end of the week, I knew exactly how they planned to win. I knew which assumptions they were relying on, which facts they were counting on me not understanding, which truths they believed were buried too deep to surface. What they didn't realize was that they had revealed the shape of the trap they were setting. And once you see the trap clearly, it stops being frightening. The night before the next hearing, I laid the divorce papers back into their envelope and slid them into a drawer. I didn't shred them. I didn't mark them up. I didn't sign a single page. Instead, I made a list. Not of grievances, not of emotions, but of facts, dates, clauses, statements that contradicted one another, assumptions they were making without realizing they'd made them. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. They believed this was the chapter where I broke, where the weight of the law finally crushed whatever resistance I had left. They believed the story was moving toward its inevitable conclusion. What they didn't understand was that by showing me exactly how they intended to erase me, they had also shown me where their story was weakest. And for the first time since the laughter in the courtroom, I felt something close to calm. Not because the threat was gone, but because I finally knew where to strike. Silence became my shield in the days that followed, not the hollow kind born from fear, but a deliberate stillness that gave me room to think. Daniel mistook it for surrender. I could see it in the way his shoulders loosened, in how he stopped watching his words so carefully. He believed the paperwork had done its job. He believed pressure, once applied, would finish the rest for him. Inside, I was calmer than I had been in months. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped reacting to every provocation. When Daniel spoke, I listened without interrupting, storing his assumptions away like notes for later. When Claire appeared in the house, moving through rooms with the confidence of someone already redecorating in her mind, I acknowledged her presence with polite indifference and nothing more. They didn't know what to do with that. Silence denies people feedback. It starves their need for reassurance. And slowly, it made them careless. My first deliberate move was small enough to go unnoticed. I told Daniel I needed copies of some older records for my own peace of mind. He waved a hand dismissively and pointed me toward a box in the garage. "Take whatever you need," he said. "It's all outdated anyway." That assumption almost made me smile. The box was dusty, shoved behind paint cans and unused tools. I carried it into the house and sorted through it slowly, methodically. Most of it was exactly what Daniel thought it was: old contracts, expired permits, irrelevant paperwork. And then I found the thing that connected everything. It wasn't dramatic, no bold headline, just a cross-reference that aligned perfectly with the clause I had already confirmed. Two pieces of a puzzle Daniel was certain no one else remembered. My hands were steady as I read. That mattered more than the discovery itself. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Instead, I made another call. This time to someone even further removed from Daniel's world, a person who had no loyalty to him and no reason to protect his version of events. When I explained what I was looking at, there was a pause, longer than the first time. "You should hold on to that," they said finally, very carefully. That was all the confirmation I needed. From that moment on, my silence changed texture. It wasn't just restraint, it was strategy. I set rules for myself. No emotional confrontations, no ultimatums, no revealing what I knew. Every interaction became observational. I noted when Daniel contradicted himself, when he overstated his certainty, when Claire spoke as if decisions were already final. They believed momentum was on their side. They believed the court was a formality. They believed the story had been told often enough that it would be accepted as truth. What they didn't understand was how systems actually work. The law doesn't reward the loudest voice. It rewards precision, consistency, documentation. And Daniel had built his entire case on the assumption that I would never look closely enough to notice the gaps. The irony was almost unbearable. There was a moment, late one evening, when Daniel poured himself a drink and leaned against the counter, studying me with something like curiosity. "You're taking this better than I expected," he said. I met his gaze evenly. "I'm tired of fighting," he nodded, satisfied. "That's smart." He had no idea how true that was. As the hearing approached, I could feel the shift inside me. The courtroom no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a stage where a poorly rehearsed performance was about to collapse under its own weight. I thought back to the judge's interruption, the way she had stopped him without raising her voice, the way authority had cut through noise effortlessly. At the time, I hadn't understood why it mattered so much. Now I did. The judge had been waiting for arrogance to overplay its hand, waiting for certainty to turn into contradiction. Daniel and Claire thought the next hearing would end things. They talked about it openly, carelessly, about where they'd go afterward, about how quickly the house could be reset. They never asked what I planned to do next. The night before the hearing, I laid out everything I needed in a neat stack. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just carefully, each document in order, each fact aligned. I didn't rehearse speeches, I didn't practice arguments, I didn't need to. This wasn't about persuasion. It was about letting the truth surface in a room that finally demanded it. As I turned off the light and climbed into bed, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even afraid. I felt prepared. They believed silence meant weakness because that was how they used it against others. They never considered that silence could also mean restraint, or confidence, or patience. They believed I was waiting for permission to speak. In reality, I was waiting for the right moment to let the system speak for me. And when that moment came, there would be nothing they could do to interrupt it. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that pressed down on the city and made everything feel heavier than it needed to be. I parked 2 blocks away from the courthouse and walked the rest, my heels clicking against the pavement in a steady rhythm that kept my breathing even. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Voices echoed down the hallway, hushed and sharp at the same time. I took a seat on a hard wooden bench and waited, hands folded in my lap, eyes forward. I had dressed simply on purpose, nothing flashy, nothing defensive. I didn't want to look like I was trying to prove anything. I was already being judged anyway. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later, loud enough to announce himself without saying a word. He walked in with the easy confidence of someone used to being deferred to, his attorney beside him, already smiling as if this were a routine meeting he'd scheduled between calls. Claire followed a step behind, immaculate, composed, her expression somewhere between bored and amused. She looked at me and smiled. It was brief, deliberate, and deeply insulting. The kind of smile meant to remind me of my place. I returned nothing. I focused instead on the way Daniel didn't even acknowledge my presence, as if I'd already been written out of the room. When we were called inside, they took their places first. Daniel leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms comfortably. His attorney spread documents across the table with practiced ease. Claire sat behind them again, close enough to be seen, close enough to matter, even if no one said her name. I sat alone. The judge entered, and the room rose and fell into silence. She looked the same as before, calm, unimpressed. Her gaze moved across the room, taking in the arrangement without comment. Daniel's attorney stood to begin. His voice was smooth, confident, and loud enough to fill the space. He spoke about timelines, contributions, reasonable expectations. He painted a picture of a marriage where one person carried the weight while the other benefited quietly. He didn't use my name much. He didn't need to. In his version of events, I was an accessory, not a participant. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a detail, his tone casual, almost amused. At one point, he let out a soft laugh when his attorney referenced my limited involvement. It wasn't loud enough to be reprimanded, but it was loud enough to be heard. I felt eyes on me then, curious, measuring, waiting for me to crack. I didn't. I kept my gaze on the judge. I watched her face instead of theirs. Watched how she let them talk longer than necessary. Watched how she made notes without interrupting. Watched how her expression didn't change, even as their confidence grew more careless. They mistook her silence for agreement. When Daniel spoke directly, it was with the ease of someone convinced he was finishing a story already decided. "I've always tried to be fair," he said, spreading his hands slightly. "I don't want conflict. I just want this resolved." Claire shifted behind him, relaxed, as if already planning lunch. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The kind that comes when you realize you're watching someone walk confidently toward a cliff they refuse to see. Then it happened. Daniel's attorney referenced a detail meant to reinforce their case, a statement about authority and decision-making that contradicted the record I had spent weeks studying. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't listening carefully. The judge's pen paused. It was just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. The smallest shift. She looked up, eyes narrowing slightly, and glanced at Daniel instead of his attorney. Daniel didn't notice. He was still smiling. The attorney continued, unaware he'd stepped onto unstable ground. He spoke faster now, building momentum, stacking assumptions on top of one another. Daniel leaned back even further, confidence spilling into arrogance. The judge raised her hand. The room went still. Daniel stopped mid-sentence, blinking in surprise. His attorney faltered, then straightened, clearly unprepared for the interruption. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. The judge didn't answer right away. She looked down at her notes, then back up at Daniel. "Mr. Carter," she said evenly, "I want to clarify something before we proceed further." Daniel straightened, his smile tightening. "Of course." She asked her question carefully, precisely. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't dramatic, it was technical. Daniel hesitated. His attorney stepped in too quickly, offering an explanation that only complicated the issue. The judge held up her hand again, this time without looking away from Daniel. "I didn't ask you," she said calmly. "I asked him." The shift in the room was immediate. Claire sat up straighter. Daniel swallowed, the confidence draining from his posture in real time. For the first time that morning he looked uncertain. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The judge glanced at me then briefly, and something passed between us. Not sympathy, recognition. She turned back to Daniel. "We're going to slow this down," she said. "There are inconsistencies here that need to be addressed." Daniel's attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. The story they had rehearsed so carefully was beginning to fray at the edges. As the judge made notes and outlined the next steps, I felt the weight in the room shift. The laughter was gone, the ease had evaporated. What remained was tension, sharp and unmistakable. Daniel no longer leaned back. He sat rigid now, eyes fixed forward, jaw clenched. Claire avoided looking at him altogether. When the judge finally nodded for proceedings to continue, it was with a tone that made one thing clear. This hearing was no longer going the way they expected. And as I sat there, hands still folded, expression neutral, I understood with absolute certainty that they had just given her the reason she needed to stop them. The fall hadn't happened yet, but the ground beneath them was already gone. The judge didn't raise her voice when she interrupted. She didn't need to. Authority, when it's real, doesn't announce itself. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone level, almost conversational. "Before we go any further, I need clarification on a specific point." Daniel straightened in his chair, the confident sprawl he'd maintained all morning snapping into something rigid. His lawyer leaned in, already preparing to intercept, but the judge's eyes never left Daniel's face. "You stated that all material decisions and authority rested solely with you," she continued. Is that correct? Yes, Daniel said quickly, too quickly. That's been the arrangement. The judge nodded once, as if filing the answer away. Then help me understand why this record indicates otherwise. The room seemed to inhale all at once. Daniel's lawyer was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, if I may... She held up a hand without turning toward him. You may not. I'm asking Mr. Carter. Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced at his attorney, then back at the bench. I'm not sure what you're referring to. The judge picked up a document from her stack, tapped it lightly against the desk. This. And before you answer, I want to be very clear. This isn't a hypothetical. It's part of the record. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel hesitated without a script. He tried to recover quickly. That document is outdated. It doesn't reflect how things functioned in practice. In practice, the judge repeated. Yet there is no amendment on file. No revocation, no replacement. She looked down again, then back up. Which means, legally, it remained in effect. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. That was never the intention. The judge tilted her head slightly. Intent doesn't override written authority. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Claire shifted in her seat, the easy confidence she'd carried in with her evaporating. She leaned forward, whispering something to Daniel, but he didn't respond. His lawyer finally found his voice. Your Honor, with respect, this is being taken out of context. The judge turned to him then, eyes sharp. Counselor, you described this case as straightforward. You emphasized clarity. You made repeated statements asserting exclusivity of control. She paused, letting the words hang. And now, she continued, you're asking this court to ignore a binding provision because it's inconvenient to your narrative. The word narrative landed like a blow. Daniel's posture collapsed inward. Not dramatically, but noticeably. He tried to explain, his sentences running into each other, each answer creating more questions than it resolved. The judge listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to me. Mrs. Carter, she said, using my name for the first time that day. Were you aware of this provision? Yes, Your Honor, I replied calmly. Did you consent to its removal or alteration at any point? No. Daniel's lawyer objected weakly. The judge overruled him just as easily. Claire's face had gone pale. She sat frozen now, no longer part of the equation, no longer sure why she was even there. The judge leaned back slightly, folding her hands. What concerns this court, she said, is not merely the existence of this document, but the repeated mischaracterization of authority and contribution. She looked directly at Daniel. You allowed this proceeding to begin under a false premise. Daniel's mouth tightened. That's not fair. The judge's expression hardened. What's not fair is expecting this court to accept selective truths. There it was. The moment his confidence cracked completely. His lawyer tried to regain control, offering explanations, reframing timelines, suggesting misunderstandings. The judge shut each attempt down with quiet precision, referencing earlier statements, pointing out contradictions, dismantling the performance piece by piece. No raised voices, no theatrics, just facts. Finally, she set her pen down. Given what has come to light, she said, this court is not prepared to proceed under the assumptions presented. Daniel stared straight ahead now, his face flushed, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch. I am issuing an interim ruling, the judge continued. The proposed settlement is suspended. Any attempt to pressure acceptance under misrepresented authority is inappropriate and will not be entertained. Claire's breath hitched audibly. Furthermore, the judge added, this court will require full disclosure and review before any further consideration. That includes a reassessment of roles, authority, and contributions previously asserted. She looked at Daniel one last time. We will reconvene once that is complete. The gavel came down softly. It was over, not finished, but changed forever. As the courtroom began to stir, I remained seated, letting the noise wash over me. I felt no urge to look at Daniel, no satisfaction in his discomfort. What I felt instead was something steadier. Relief. When I finally stood, I caught the judge's eye briefly. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. Outside, Daniel's lawyer was already speaking in urgent tones, gesturing sharply, the calm professionalism gone. Daniel stood stiffly, listening, no longer leading the conversation. Claire hovered uncertainly at the edge, suddenly irrelevant. They had walked in laughing. They were leaving recalculating. As I stepped into the hallway, the weight I'd been carrying for months lifted just enough for me to breathe freely again. This wasn't a victory parade. It wasn't revenge served hot. It was something better. It was being impossible to dismiss. And as I walked away, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would never laugh in a courtroom again. The moment the judge left the bench, the room exhaled like it had been holding its breath for hours. Chairs scraped softly. Voices rose in cautious murmurs. People gathered papers, checking phones, already recalibrating their understanding of what they had just witnessed. I stayed seated. Daniel stood immediately, his movements sharp and restless, as if speed alone could undo what had happened. His lawyer leaned close, speaking in low, urgent tones that carried none of the confidence he'd displayed earlier. I caught fragments as they passed. Unexpected, needs review, damage control. Words meant to sound technical, but edged with alarm. Claire hovered a step behind them, no longer sure where she belonged. She looked around the courtroom like someone who had just realized the rules had changed mid-game. When Daniel moved, she followed instinctively, then stopped, uncertain. No one reached for her. No one included her in the conversation. She was already fading from relevance. Daniel glanced at me then, for the first time since the ruling. His eyes were sharp, searching, accusatory. He looked like a man trying to decide whether he had been betrayed or outplayed. "You knew," he said, his voice low, tight. I met his gaze evenly. I knew the truth. He scoffed, though it sounded brittle. "You let us walk in there blind." I stood then, slowly, deliberately. "You let yourselves walk in blind," I said. "You just didn't think I'd notice." His lawyer cut in quickly, pulling him aside, whispering something that made Daniel's face flush. Claire took a tentative step forward, opening her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again when no one looked at her. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with energy the moment we stepped into it. Conversations paused as we passed. People watched openly now, no longer pretending neutrality. The shift was unmistakable. Daniel felt it too. His shoulders were tense, his movements abrupt. Family members who had sat behind him moments earlier avoided eye contact. One of them checked their phone with sudden intensity. Another murmured something about traffic and slipped away without saying goodbye. The alliance was dissolving in real time. Daniel stopped near the elevators and turned back to me, his expression hardening. "This isn't over," he said. "You've complicated things." I nodded once. That tends to happen when assumptions meet facts. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You made me look like a liar." I didn't raise mine. "You did that yourself?" For a second, something flickered across his face. Anger, yes, but also something else. Fear, the kind that creeps in when control slips and doesn't come back easily. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, urgency sharpening his tone. "We need to talk. Now." Daniel hesitated, glaring at me as if memorizing my face, then turned away. Claire lingered for a moment, watching him go, then hurried after them, her heels clicking unevenly against the tile. I stood alone in the hallway, the noise flowing around me like water. For the first time in a long while, I felt no need to rush, no need to explain, no need to prove anything. The victory wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was structural. Over the next few days, the ripples spread exactly as I'd expected. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. People who once spoke Daniel's name with admiration now lowered their voices when it came up. Doubt is contagious that way. Once introduced, it doesn't stay contained. Daniel tried to regain footing, to control the narrative, but the narrative no longer belonged to him alone. Every move he made was now scrutinized, every claim checked against the record. He reached out once, late one evening, his tone carefully neutral. "We should talk," he said. "Privately." I considered it, then declined. "There's nothing left to clarify." He didn't argue. He hung up without another word. That was when I understood the finality of it. Not because the legal process was complete, it wasn't, but because the power dynamic had irreversibly changed. He no longer dictated terms. He reacted to them, and reaction was never his strength. The strangest part was how little satisfaction I felt watching it unfold. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. What I felt was distance, emotional space where tension used to live. I thought about all the moments I had been made to feel small. All the times silence had been used against me. How easily that silence had been mistaken for weakness. Karma, I realized, doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as exposure, as the removal of protection, as the simple act of letting someone face the consequences of their own certainty. Daniel believed the worst thing that could happen had already happened. He thought the ruling was the storm. He didn't yet understand that it was only the weather changing. As I walked away from the courthouse for the last time that week, the city felt different. Not brighter, not lighter, just clearer. Like a fog had lifted, revealing familiar streets I hadn't realized I'd been navigating blind. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me there. The story they had tried to write without me was unraveling, not because I tore it apart, but because it couldn't survive the truth. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Untouchable. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before, not tense or hollow, just settled, as if it had finally stopped waiting for someone to come back and argue with it. I stood at the kitchen window one morning, coffee cooling in my hands, watching sunlight spill across the counter, and realized that the noise I'd been living with for years was gone. Time had passed since the hearing. Not enough for everything to be resolved on paper, but enough for the truth to settle into place. The calls slowed. The urgency faded. The world moved on, and so did I. There were things I could have fought harder for, items, titles, moments of public acknowledgement. I chose not to. Not because I didn't deserve them, but because I no longer needed them to confirm who I was. I let go of the impulse to collect proof of my worth from the people who had worked so hard to deny it. What I reclaimed instead was quieter, but far more durable. I reclaimed my voice, not in speeches or confrontations, but in the simple certainty of my own decisions. I reclaimed my credibility, the kind that doesn't need applause. I reclaimed the part of myself that had been slowly compressed into the margins of someone else's ambition. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't explaining my choices to anyone. Looking back now, I can see how love was used against my loyalty, how my willingness to support became an expectation to disappear. I don't hate myself for that. I forgive the version of me who believed endurance was the same thing as strength. She was doing the best she could with what she knew. And what she didn't know then, I know now. Daniel faded from my daily thoughts faster than I expected. I heard updates through others, fragments of a life adjusting to scrutiny, plans delayed, relationships strained, confidence replaced by caution. I didn't follow the details closely. His consequences were no longer my responsibility. That, in itself, felt like freedom. My life didn't transform overnight into something dramatic or enviable. It didn't need to. Stability returned first, then clarity. I focused on my work again, on friendships I had neglected, on routines that felt grounding rather than confining. I rebuilt trust slowly, starting with myself. There is a particular peace that comes from knowing you will never again shrink, to make someone else feel taller. Sometimes I think about the woman I was standing in that courtroom, listening to laughter meant to humiliate her. I wish I could reach back and tell her what I know now. That silence can be preparation. That power doesn't always announce itself. That being underestimated is often the beginning, not the end. The lesson I carry forward is simple, but it cost me everything to learn it. Never assume your worth must be proven to people committed to misunderstanding you. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever been dismissed, erased, or quietly replaced while being told to stay calm and reasonable, I want you to know this. The story is not over just because someone else is speaking louder right now. Strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like gathering facts while others perform. Sometimes it looks like walking into a room where everyone expects you to lose and letting the truth do the work for you. I didn't win by destroying anyone. I didn't need to. I won by becoming impossible to dismiss. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought you were finished? What happened when you finally stopped trying to prove yourself to them? Share your experience in the comments. You never know who might need to read it. And if you want to stay for more real stories about justice, dignity, and quiet revenge that doesn't lose its humanity, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories matter, especially to those of us who have spent too long being told to stay silent. Some victories don't come with applause. They come with peace. And sometimes that's the most powerful ending of all.